Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that almost everything holding your world together is gone. No police protecting the streets, no government you trust, no reliable money, no guarantee that the road outside your town is even safe. Now imagine that the people around you still remember when all of those things worked. Roughly 1,500 years ago, millions of people in Western Europe lived through something similar. For centuries, Rome had connected an enormous world. Roads linked cities, forts, farms, mines, and ports. Ships carried grain, oil, wine, pottery, and metal across the Mediterranean. Coins circulated across huge distances. Aqueducts supplied cities with water. Officials collected taxes. Courts enforced law. Professional armies guarded the borders. Rome was not a paradise. Slavery was widespread. Inequality was extreme. Disease and political violence were common, but Rome had built something incredibly difficult to replace: a gigantic network. And networks are powerful because every part supports another. Cities can grow when distant farms reliably send food. Merchants can specialize when roads and ships let them reach buyers. Governments can maintain roads when taxes arrive. Armies can defend borders when governments can pay soldiers. Now reverse that process. If taxes stop arriving, armies become harder to pay. If armies weaken, roads and trade routes become less secure. If trade shrinks, cities lose resources. If cities shrink, governments collect even less. One failure begins feeding another. That is much closer to what happened to the Western Roman Empire. Rome did not collapse in one morning. Its problems accumulated over generations. Emperors were overthrown or murdered. Civil wars consumed soldiers and money. The empire became harder to govern. Its borders remained enormous. And outside those borders, powerful groups were moving: Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, Saxons, and others. Romans often called them barbarians, but that word hides more than it explains. These peoples had leaders, families, alliances, economies, traditions, and their own reasons for moving. Some fought Rome. Some traded with Rome. Some served in Roman armies. Then the Huns pushed westward, increasing pressure on Roman territory. In 376, large numbers of Goths crossed the Danube seeking refuge inside the empire. Roman authorities let them enter, then badly mishandled the situation. Food became scarce. Abuse followed. Rebellion exploded. 2 years later, Roman forces met the Goths near Adrianople. Rome expected victory. Instead, the Roman army suffered a catastrophic defeat. Emperor Valens was killed. Thousands of Roman soldiers died. Rome was no longer untouchable. The empire survived, but the pressure continued. Then in 410, the Visigothic king Alaric entered Rome and sacked the city. Rome was no longer the political capital of the West, but its symbolic importance was enormous. For centuries, Romans had watched disasters happen somewhere else. Now foreign soldiers were inside Rome itself. The message was clear. Something fundamental was changing. The Vandals established themselves in North Africa. The Visigoths controlled territory in Gaul and Spain. The Franks expanded. Roman authority disappeared from Britain. Western emperors controlled less and less. Then, in 476, the Germanic commander Odoacer removed the young Emperor Romulus Augustulus. That date is traditionally used as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But for ordinary people, there was no giant moment when civilization simply switched off. The next morning still came. Farmers harvested crops, parents fed children, blacksmiths worked metal, priests held services, merchants tried to sell goods, local rulers demanded taxes. The Roman world did not vanish. It fragmented. In some places, change was violent and fast. In others, Roman institutions survived for generations. And in the eastern half of the empire, Rome did not fall at all. The Eastern Roman Empire continued from Constantinople for almost another 1,000 years. Today we usually call it the Byzantine Empire. Its citizens simply called themselves Romans. So when people talk about the Dark Ages, they are mainly talking about parts of Western Europe after Western Roman political authority collapsed. And even there, darkness did not fall evenly. What did decline was complexity. Imagine Roman Britain before imperial rule disappeared. Coins circulate. Imported pottery arrives from distant workshops. Soldiers receive supplies through organized networks. Specialized workers construct large buildings. Then Roman administration withdraws. The soldiers leave. Coin production collapses. Long-distance imports become less common. Towns shrink. Stone buildings stop being maintained. The roads remain, but roads do not maintain themselves. They crack. Drainage fails. Vegetation pushes through. Bridges deteriorate. A route that once moved armies can slowly become a rough path. The same happens to aqueducts, public baths, and giant cities. All of them require workers, money, supplies, and organization. Remove the system supporting them, and they become harder to maintain. So people adapted. Life became more local. Communities increasingly depended on what could be produced nearby. Local rulers mattered more. Local warriors mattered more. Local farms mattered more. The Roman economic machine broke into smaller regional economies. For an ordinary person, the world could suddenly feel much smaller. A Roman merchant might encounter goods made hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Generations later, his descendants might use mostly things produced in their own region. Trade did not disappear. Its scale changed. And that difference matters because civilization is not only about knowledge, it is about coordination. A Roman architect might know exactly how to design an enormous public building. But knowledge alone does not build it. You need quarry workers, stone cutters, transport, engineers, laborers, money, political authority, food, and an organization capable of coordinating everything. Remove that organization, and advanced knowledge can become practically useless. Technology does not always disappear because people forget. Sometimes the world around that technology can no longer support it. And yet people kept building. They kept farming, trading, writing, fighting, experimenting. Slowly, new systems replaced the old ones. One of the most important surviving institutions was the Christian Church. As political authority fragmented, churches and monasteries remained connected across large areas. Monasteries became places of worship, but also places where manuscripts could be copied and preserved. There was no printing press. Every copy had to be made by hand. A monk could spend weeks or months copying one book. Parchment had to be prepared from animal skin. A mistake might mean scraping ink from an expensive page. Books represented enormous amounts of labor. That makes what survived remarkable. Religious works were copied. Historical accounts were copied. Parts of ancient Greek and Roman literature survived through manuscript traditions maintained across centuries. Not everything survived. Enormous amounts of ancient writing were lost. But without medieval copying, we would know far less about the ancient world today. Meanwhile, new political powers were emerging. The Franks expanded across much of Western Europe. Centuries after the last Western Roman emperor disappeared, one Frankish ruler built an empire of his own: Charlemagne. By the late 8th century, Charlemagne controlled enormous territories across Western and Central Europe. He fought campaigns, expanded his kingdom, supported churches and monasteries, and encouraged reforms in administration and education. Then, on Christmas Day in the year 800, he was crowned emperor in Rome. Think about how strange that was. More than 3 centuries after the Western Roman Empire had supposedly fallen, a new ruler was deliberately using Roman imperial legitimacy. Rome was gone, but the idea of Rome was still powerful. That pattern appears again and again. The old world dies, but pieces survive inside the new one. Roman law influenced later legal traditions. Latin survived. Roman roads kept shaping travel. Christian institutions inherited parts of Roman organization. New kings ruled former Roman territory while claiming connections to Roman prestige. And Western Europe was not developing alone. The Byzantine Empire remained a major power. Constantinople became one of the greatest cities in the world. Beginning in the 7th century, the Islamic world expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Cities such as Baghdad became major centers of scholarship, trade, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Knowledge moved between cultures. Greek works were translated. Ideas were preserved, criticized, expanded, and transmitted. Indian mathematical concepts traveled west. Scholars built on Greek, Persian, Indian, and other traditions. So calling the entire period a global dark age makes almost no sense. Much of the world was not dark at all. Even Western Europe was changing. Agriculture improved, settlements evolved, political institutions changed, trade networks grew again, populations eventually expanded. Then came the Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, Scandinavian raiders struck coastal communities with fast, shallow longships that could cross seas and travel deep into rivers. But Vikings were not only raiders. They were traders, explorers, settlers, mercenaries, and rulers. They traveled east through river systems in what is now Russia and Ukraine. They traded with the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. They settled Iceland and Greenland. Around the year 1000, Norse voyagers reached North America. The supposedly isolated Dark Ages were connected across astonishing distances. Life was still dangerous. Disease, famine, crop failure, and war could destroy communities. For families living close to subsistence, one failed harvest could be dangerous. Two could be catastrophic. There were no global supply chains waiting to replace a lost harvest. That vulnerability shaped medieval life. But vulnerability is not stupidity. A medieval farmer needed deep practical knowledge of soil, seasons, animals, weather, storage, planting, and harvesting. A blacksmith understood how heat changed metal. A carpenter understood wood. A sailor understood currents and wind. These people were not failed modern humans. They were humans solving problems with the knowledge and technology available to them. They were not waiting for civilization to restart. They were rebuilding it, piece by piece, generation by generation. Kings increasingly depended on powerful landholders. Castles transformed warfare and political control. Towns expanded. Markets grew. Trade intensified. Schools developed around churches and cathedrals. Eventually, universities appeared. Bologna traces its origins to the 11th century. Oxford was teaching by the late 11th or early 12th century. Paris became another major intellectual center. Think about the direction of travel. The story began with collapsing institutions, shrinking towns, disrupted trade, and fragmented political authority. Now institutions capable of educating scholars from different regions were appearing again. Europe was becoming more interconnected. Population grew. Commerce expanded. Cathedrals rose over medieval cities. Some were so ambitious that construction lasted longer than the lives of the people who began them. A worker might spend his entire adult life building a cathedral he knew he would never see completed. His son might continue. His grandson might finally see it finished. That is not a civilization incapable of planning. That is a civilization planning beyond individual lifetimes. Which brings us back to the name. The Dark Ages. Historians today generally avoid using it as a precise label for the entire medieval period. Renaissance thinkers admired classical Greece and Rome. To them, the centuries between antiquity and their own age could look like an interruption. Ancient brilliance on one side, Renaissance brilliance on the other, darkness in between. But history does not work like that. Civilizations gain things, lose things, preserve things, reinvent things, and sometimes build something completely different from what came before. The centuries after Western Rome collapsed absolutely contained decline. Towns shrank, political structures fragmented, infrastructure deteriorated. Some trade networks contracted. Literacy became less widespread in parts of society. Violence could be severe. Ignoring that would be misleading. But decline was only half the story, because while one system was breaking apart, another world was being constructed from its pieces. The Dark Ages were not an empty space between Rome and the modern world. They were the workshop in between, a chaotic period in which millions of people inherited the ruins of one of history's greatest empires and slowly figured out what could replace it. Some Roman knowledge survived, some disappeared. Some institutions adapted, others collapsed. New kingdoms formed. New technologies spread. New trade networks emerged. New centers of knowledge appeared. So imagine that first morning again. You wake up and the system you believed was permanent is beginning to disappear. The roads are still outside. The buildings are still standing. The old laws still exist. People still remember the empire. But the invisible network that made all of those things work is breaking. What would you do? Millions of people had to answer that question. And their answer was not to sit in darkness for 1,000 years. It was to adapt, to preserve what they could, to abandon what no longer worked, to borrow ideas from other peoples, to build new institutions, and eventually to create a world capable of moving forward again. Rome fell. Civilization did not. It changed. And that difference is why the Dark Ages are far more interesting than their name suggests.